So, how to do a site audit? How many people were at the talk yesterday of almost the same name? Okay, you guys are really committed to doing site audits. Well, this talk will be a little bit different. A lot different. Because it's not as focused on automated techniques. Much more how to be judgmental. So, how to be a judgmental person who writes fancy reports. Check. Okay. So, my name is Jody Hamilton. I am the co-owner and CTO of ZipTech, which is in Philadelphia. Really, I've been doing Drupal almost 10 years, and I've always sort of been a generalist. So I enjoy doing site audits because you get to really just judge everything, and you're not responsible for like actually doing anything. So, oh, sorry, can you see that? I can make it a little bigger, potentially. So I think being a generalist is good for doing a site audit because you get to really look at every aspect of a site. It's really up to you, to some extent, what you're going to cover. Sorry, I like an insane person, decided I was going to, for fun, use a Microsoft product to make my slides, to just, mix it up a little bit. Okay. It's called Swag. It's like some weird Microsoft online product. Okay, so anyway, I'm the CTO of ZipTech. You can tweet me at Jody Hamilton at ZipTech. Moving on. So how do site audits come to happen? And how do you, I guess from my perspective, it's like, how do I actually sell people these site audits? Because they're a great way to get into a project. And there's all different reasons why people will either ask for a site audit or be convinced that they should have a site audit. And so some of these are that if you're transferring a project, so you had an old dev team and you decided, or they decided that you're not working together anymore, you have to transfer it to a new team. A lot of times the new team feels like they need to do an audit just in order to understand the project that they're taking over. Another one that I'm dealing with right now is that there's an internal management change inside of a large organization. So for an audit that I'm doing now, it's like their site was being managed by one team, and now they're splitting up the company, and that team isn't going to be managing their site anymore. So now they need to be managing the site, but they have no experience with the site, and they want to find out what it is they're dealing with. They might have actual specific concerns that they want to audit, so concerns about security or performance or IA or something else that they feel like needs to be investigated. Or they might be planning a whole new phase of their project, and they would like to kind of understand where they're at with their site before they get into that. Sometimes they had a different team or an internal team do the project, and somebody doesn't think that it was done right. So sometimes someone wants an audit to prove that things weren't done right, and other times someone comes and they want an audit to show their boss that they did do things right, and to validate that people should get off of their back. For example, we had somebody who wanted an audit because his boss kept on telling him that he did the site wrong because he used multiple content types, and his boss was sure that you should only ever have one content type. So he wanted an audit that would back him up and say he did a good job. He did a great job. So another reason you may have an audit in 2015 and 16 is that you're considering upgrading to Drupal 8, and nobody can give you a good estimate of how much it's actually going to cost you to upgrade because nobody knows what your site even does or what kinds of problems it has. So you might need an audit just to help you evaluate that. Oh, I want to mention that on the dollars slide. I saw a talk about site audits a few years ago, maybe at Backend, and it was really focused on the ethics of site audits, and it was like saying that you should never do a site audit for a client that you're also going to be doing project work for. I thought that was sort of like, because it's sort of like for the same reason that you wouldn't do a financial audit, with someone who you're also doing business with, because it's sort of a conflict of interest. Like, you want to have an external third-party auditor. I thought that was a really interesting point, but I couldn't ultimately get behind that because I feel like the world is not covered. It looks like it is, perhaps this weekend, but the world is not covered in excellent Drupal developers. So it's not like easy to just find an excellent Drupal developer to do a great audit and then find a different team to then do the work. Like, if it was, then maybe that would make more sense. But it's like, if you found someone really good to do your audit, why wouldn't you just keep working with them? It is a matter of trust, and there is definitely some conflict of interest, because if the person that you're going to be working with doing the audit is also going to be potentially doing the work that you've identified in the audit, then of course it's in their interest to find more issues in the audit. So there is like a conflict of interest there, but it's like with any relationship, it's just a matter of how much you trust them. I think honest people don't just throw bull crap into an audit in order to get work, but it could happen. So a lot of times people do audits as loss leaders, because an audit is a really good way to get your foot in the door with a new client. So you'll give a fixed bid audit and typically go way over the hours that you were basing that bid on, with the hope that doing a really excellent audit is going to lead to more work in the future, and a lot of times it does. And typically an audit takes about a week of work. Sort of depends on how much time you let it take, but I usually let it be about a week of work for 1 to 2 people. Okay, so this is Judge Judy. They call me this at work. They call me Judge Jody, because I'm very judgmental. Now, being judgmental is one of those personality traits that's sort of positive and negative. It has a lot of negative sides. Oh, you're so judgmental. But when it comes to doing certain types of tasks, being judgmental is very useful. So you might have some people on your team that are very open and accepting and hippy-dippy, oh, that's an interesting idea, and oh, that's an interesting idea too. They don't really disagree very strongly, right? They're not necessarily the best ones to do an audit, because they'll go through and think, oh, that's interesting. So someone who really has strong opinions can really go through faster and decide what looks problematic and has an eye for criticism. So sometimes it's just you have your one of your top people do an audit, but you can also split it up into multiple domain experts. Sort of depends on what you're auditing, and I'll talk about the different concerns that you can audit. And I also like to have an assistant when I'm doing auditing, someone more junior who can help me write up the document, do the document formatting, and learn while we're going along. Because as you're working on audit, you're not just learning how to do a site audit, you're also learning a lot about Drupal and the different issues people can get into making these sites. In fact, I've learned probably more from looking at all the awful sites that we inherit than I probably would have just building sites on my own. Because you see the consequences of all the different bad common practices that people make and where it leads them and how much work it ends up being to clean them up. So it makes me feel more strongly about oh yes, we never do this, and this is why, like we've seen what happens. And it's also good to have the auditor or someone on the auditing team be the same people who would potentially continue working on this project if this is an ongoing project or might become an ongoing project, because no matter how much they write in their report, they're also putting a lot in their head about getting to know this project. And so that's really valuable, and you want them to continue working on this project once they've got to know it, because it actually takes a long time to really get to know a project if it's a pretty complicated site. Okay, so I think my method, so John's talk yesterday was very focused on automated tools, and I definitely think there's a part of that in an audit, and you should use those tools. But I also like to do a lot manually and just use this idea of like, I'm just looking everywhere. I'll look from the top left pixel all the way across the page to the bottom right, and then I'll look at the server, and I'll look at the code, and I'll look at every different page, and I'll look at the HTML, and I'll look at the CSS. I like to just look everywhere and try to see everything. And I was talking to someone a day or two ago who's saying that they have to do site audits and they find it really boring. And I don't really find it boring, because what I do is I sort of start an outline in a Google Doc, and then of all like these different places I might look and different approaches I might take. And then when I get bored with one of them, I just jump to a different one. And so I can procrastinate, like, oh, I don't feel like looking at the permissions right now, so I'm going to go look at the design or whatever. And I can keep jumping around until it starts to fill itself out. So the first steps when you are going to start an audit is you have to get access. And sometimes that's a problem. And actually, if that is a problem to get access to the server or to the Codebase or to get a copy of the database, that's almost, that in itself can be a finding of the audit, okay? Because the fact that the people that you're working with don't know how to get you a copy of the database or access to the server, or they don't have an SSH keys or whatever, this is sort of part of the environment that the site is living in. So it sort of could itself be a finding. If they refuse to give you access because they have some security reasons and nothing you can sign is going to do anything about it, you'll be really limited in what you can audit. So you'll have to have a smaller scope to your audit. You ideally want to work locally and just get a local copy of the site setup, because that way you can click around everywhere, run all the reports you want, and not have to worry about messing anything up, because as an auditor, you want to absolutely change nothing that you're looking at, right? So you're going to be clicking around everywhere, never hit save, never mess anything up, especially if you're having to look at the live site, which I hope you're not. So again, you want to look everywhere. You're not typically in an audit, the more you find, the better. Like you're not going to lose points for looking at things that they didn't think you were supposed to be looking at. Take notes the entire time that you're looking, and then you can eventually write those up into a better document. Now, one of the most important things about the audit, and I think a lot of times people skip this because they think, oh, well, I don't want to be biased. I want to do and sometimes the client even thinks that way too. I don't want to bias the auditor by actually talking to them. But you can't really separate a site from the process and the people that are running it. So I think it's really important that you have some meetings. So first of all, you want to have a kickoff meeting where you just try to get some basic background information about why they want to do this audit, how this site came to be, what it's supposed to be doing, who's involved. Try to make sure you have access to everything. I like to not get into too much at that kickoff meeting other than basic understanding of the site's situational awareness, but then after a day or two of digging into the site, I like to have another meeting because then I have probably already some questions and I'm wondering a bunch of things, and I'm very focused on the project at that point. And then I like to really dig in and ask them questions about what their specific concerns are, because you want to make sure that you're auditing and paying special attention to things that they're focused on and that they are concerned about with the site. They might have like specific issues, they might be concerned about security or whatever. And it's also important to have these meetings to get a sense of their technical vocabulary and backgrounds and who you're actually addressing in this audit. You might be addressing them, you might be addressing their bosses, but it's really easy to make an audit that makes you look really smart and they will not use it all because they don't understand what you're talking about, and you're not like making the points clear enough, and then you just have this huge pile of paper that they do nothing with because it's intimidating to them. Okay, so I like to, as I'm going through the audit, go through different concerns or topics, and then also go through different layers. And there's a lot of, so by layers I mean like layers of the stack. So I'm going to talk to you about what the different concerns are you might be looking at, and then the different layers you might be looking at. And there's like overlap between the concerns and the layers, but there's sort of two different ways you can approach all the different things you might need to audit. So it really depends on the audit you're doing, what the client's concerns are, as well as what your focus is, what your competencies are, and what you are actually going to audit. So for me, what I typically focus on are security, because security is always something you should include in an audit. Performance, although sometimes people aren't they're satisfied with their performance and they don't want to get too into that, but so I'll just do it like a little bit. Maintainability is probably the item that I focus on the most because it's usually the most lacking. I don't even know if maintainability is like a real word, but to me it means everything that goes into how difficult the site is to maintain, because that's often something that people don't think about very much when they're making a project. Like they're just trying to make it work. And now, a couple years later, the problem that the organization is having is that it's expensive and difficult to maintain it in lots of different ways. So I really focus on that because I think that's where a lot of the problems fall under, and it explains a lot of the best practices that we point out to them. Like the reason that these are best practices and the reason that these are important is that they're going to help your maintainability. And then usability and IA, information architecture, are things that I tend to notice really easily, and I think are also super important, since the whole purpose of most websites is for humans to use them and find information. So I like to look at how difficult it is for me as a new person coming to this site. A lot of times I will do an audit for a week, and then if you ask, and I'm reading tons of stuff on all these pages about the company, I'm clicking, I'm doing everything. And if you ask me afterwards, like, what does this company do? Like, what's the purpose of their website? Like, what are they selling? Like, what is their product? Sometimes I have no idea. After spending a week doing nothing but looking at their website, and I'm like, well, there must be like a lot of people that come to this website for less than a week. And a lot of them probably aren't as sharp as me. So I'm guessing that most people come to this website and have no idea what this organization even does, because I certainly don't. And I think noticing things like that is incredibly valuable, because it's like they could talk all day about making their performance better or this and that, but it's like if their website's pointless because nobody even knows what their organization is after they look at it. I also focus a lot on process, and that can be sometimes difficult to see in an audit because process involves like their whole organization. You might not get that much access to it. But for example, I did an audit recently where they told me that they were having all of these constant bugs and issues and problems, and that's why they needed an audit. And every time I tried to press them to give me a list or any examples of specifics, they didn't have one. And I was like, okay, well that is kind of a problem. So you're just, so all of your different managers are just reporting to you that there are problems, but you're not keeping a list of them, and then you expect us to fix them? I mean, how are we going to fix them if we don't even know what the list is? So yeah, their problem was that they thought that others could read their minds or something. That was strange. And then these other ones, I don't typically do in my audits, but you can mix and match and do whatever topics you want in audit, whatever the client wants, whatever your focus is. You can focus on SEO, accessibility, design, there's lots of things that you can audit for. Okay, now I'm going to talk about I'm going to go back to those concerns in more detail, but first I'm going to talk about the different layers of the stack that you're going to want to examine. So Drupal has many layers, so you're going to want to really look at a site, you're going to want to look at as many of them as you can. So there's the Codebase, which I'm going to talk about each of these separately, but I don't look at the Codebase, I don't read every single line of it in doing an audit unless they were going to pay me for some crazy audit. Then there's the database, obviously, and then there's the server. Sometimes you don't have access to the server. They won't give you access to the server, so you can't audit it. Other times, they might be on Aqua or Pantheon hosting, which is a very standardized environment, in which case you don't really need to audit the server setup as much. And so I put these backend and frontend in quotes because Drupal doesn't really have a concept of a backend or a frontend. It's just different pages and different roles. But it's really important to log in as every single role that they have. That's sort of time consuming. And this is where your assistant might come in. But it's super important because to really see what is the experience of their staff that's using the site, you have to log in as them and see what they're seeing and try adding content and try clicking around all the different things that they have as an administrator or an editor or whatever. And then, of course, you want to look at the experience if you're not logged in for a standard visitor, assuming that it's not an intranet or something like that. Okay, so this is John Peck's module that he was talking about a lot at the talk yesterday. So Site Audit module is a really great place to start. I like to try to do a lot of these automated systems first, or have the junior person run them all, and then kind of go through all of the results and get rid of stuff that's doesn't look very important or whatever. But so Site Audit module works with a bunch of the other related modules, you can add security review and hacked module and stuff, and it runs all kinds of stuff related to best practices and security. Make sure cron's running, make sure caching's enabled, all kinds of everything that you would typically find going through manually that can kind of be automated. A lot of that stuff is automated by that. So you definitely want to run this. I think one of the issues I have with just mostly doing these automated reports is that there's no real sense of, in these reports, it can't really know what's relatively more important than other things. So it can tell you oh yeah, well you need to turn on block caching, but it can't tell you oh yeah, well if you turn on block caching, it'll make your pages a tenth of a millisecond faster, right? So it's so small that it's not going to matter, right? Because especially with any of these things, but with performance, you might have certain problems that are really large, that are taking up a lot of your page load time, and then you might have 1,000 other problems that you can find that are like minuscule. And so I find that a lot, like if how many people use Acquia hosting, and you get like those emails where they're like, here's some recommendations for like how to make things faster. And my clients get those, and they're like, Jody, you have to do these things that are on these recommendations. And I'm like, okay, but it's not really going to make your site noticeably faster. And so I feel like not only, I think the argument that they can make is like, oh, well, it's always better, right, to do things that make your site a little bit faster, no matter how small it's an improvement. But I would say no, because if you're distracting us from focusing on the important improvements by making us focus on the tiny improvements, that's actually a net negative, right? Like, that's not actually positive. You actually derailed the progress by making us focus on these tiny improvements when we need to be focusing on the big improvements. So when you get information about performance, but there's no relative gain attached, it's just like, oh yeah, that will be an improvement that you could measure. You could spend years doing these micro optimizations instead of working on the things that actually are the big problems and just never get anywhere. And the one thing I like and dislike about Site Audit module and these other like reporting tools, one thing I like is that a lot of times the clients like it, because clients like to see numbers and colors and to like have things that are measurable, and they'll fix. But what I don't like about it is that they can fixate on that regardless of how important something actually is. So I had a client recently that was obsessed with their 404s. Like, apparently they have some pages that sometimes get a 404, and it was like we're spending dozens of hours every week like fixing more and more 404s in more complicated ways. And it was like, I don't know where you got the idea that this was your major performance problem. Like, it's not at all. So, okay, so I'm going to go through each of those layers and just point out some things that I always check for because they're really common problems. And these are also interesting things to think about when you're building a site to avoid all of these problems. Okay, Codebase. So this is actually, I don't know if you can see that at all, but this is actually the sites all modules of ziptech.com. So you can see even we have tons of modules. People are module crazy in Drupal. So a really common problem is that core is behind in security updates. And so you can see that super easily. Just go to the status report or the updates page, or go to the change log or whatever. That's a security problem, but it also indicates a process problem. Because if they don't have a process to be regularly doing security updates, then that causes them to be insecure. Then you want to use hacked module because it's very common that core or contrib modules are hacked, although it's actually not as common as it used to be, because over the years, very few people, I think, make it very far into Drupal without realizing that they're not supposed to be doing that. Now, hacked module integrates with Site Audit module, and it tells you if anything has been changed, but it gives you a lot of false positives, so you have to kind of go through everything and make sure it really is a change. The other thing is that on a lot of projects, people keep track of patches that they've applied in some way. They might have a patches directory, they might have a patches.txt file, or a patches.make file, and if they've tracked these changes that they've made to core or contrib that way, that's actually an acceptable behavior as long as there's a process in place that makes sure that those patches stay applied when security updates happen. To me, actually, like, having a lot of patches is like open source at its best, because why use open source if you can't, change the source? But you absolutely have to have a really good process in place for keeping track of those patches. And I like a system called patch file, or patches make file by Dave Reed, that's on GitHub for automatically making patches reapply. If the code base contains a bunch of contributed modules that are not enabled, that's really common. It might not seem like a big problem, but it contributes to the general confusion and disorganization of being able to maintain and work with the system. I'm going to talk more about confusion later, because I think that's a huge issue. You can count the number of module directories and site style modules. I think actually Site Audit will do that for you. I used to say more than 100 was too many, but the number sort of increases over time. Like I used to say a long time ago, over 50 was too many, but nowadays it's normal to have maybe like 150. But you can get a sense that something is amiss if there's a crazy number in there. And then you also, in the code base, you want to look at custom code and evaluate that. Not necessarily every line if there's a lot of it, but you want to look at some of the custom code in detail and scan through the rest of it. And you also want to look in the theme and look at template.php. A lot of times a lot is hiding in that file. And there's some tools to help you analyze the custom code. PHP Code Sniffer, PHP Mess Detector. I think John mentioned a bunch of other ones yesterday. But I like to look at it myself as well and I try to like get an idea of the mentality of the previous developers. I start to get a sense if there seem to be multiple developers who maybe were on different levels and acted really differently, or sort of like how advanced the thinking was or how rushed the project seemed to be. The database, usually there's not a ton of things to report about the database, but some of the common problems are that if Apache isn't configured properly, I think the sessions table just keeps on getting huge. Like they can have like a gigabyte in their sessions table or something. It just makes it hard to work with the project. Same thing can happen in the variables table if they used a bunch of like weird contrib modules and never cleaned up after them, if they removed them. And an old kind of problem that I think those Site Audit and reports that will find is that if you have database tables that are in MyISM, that could be a performance problem that you can fix pretty easily. The server, a lot of times there's like performance or security issues on the server, and the security review module can find some of these. So insecure file permissions is really common. So some of the people who got hacked in Drupal Get-In, they got their whole server hacked because they had insecure file permissions. So that means that once somebody got into their site and was able to execute PHP, then they were able to get out of just the web root and get into the rest of the server because the file permissions were not set up correctly. Another really common thing, if the server is like their own server, it's not like a Drupal hosting thing, is that there's no opcode cache. And PHP without an opcode cache runs a lot slower, so that can be a big performance issue. If it's like sort of their own server, they might not have Varnish set up, or they might not have it set up correctly. Like they might be getting sessions on their site that are bypassing Varnish, and so that's a huge performance issue that can be fixed. And then another one thing that's common on the server that they don't actually have a cron job set up, so they're just using like poor man's cron that's part of Drupal, which is not quite as good. Okay, on the back end is where I really find a lot of issues, because that's where people do a lot of work in Drupal. So I'm going to get into a lot of the issues that you find on the back end when I talk about the different concerns to look at. So when I look at the back end, I usually, if they have admin menu or if they don't, then I just go to admin/index. I go through pretty much like every single page of like the admin to see like all of the settings. And a lot of times what's really common is just things are just messy. There's just a lot of everything. There's might be multiple systems for doing the same thing. You're just kind of like, there's just a million settings everywhere. It just seems like there's way more going on than what actually the site does. And a lot of times if you put yourself in the shoes of the editors, the editor experience isn't very good. The WYSIWYG isn't set up very well. There's like a million different fields on every content type, and they're in a weird order, and there's no help text. And you're like, okay, like I thought that we were building a CMS here, so we didn't really accomplish that very well if it's hard to manage content. Another thing is that it might be really easy to break. Like if you click the wrong thing when you're adding content or whatever, it puts it right on the home page and without an image, and it looks all broken. And I look at the front end as well, just because I think it's pretty important. But I don't get all into like design criticism, but I'm more focused on usability. So common things that you find wrong on the front end, most sites these days are somewhat responsive or mostly responsive, but if you actually test them at all different sizes, you might find like a responsive dead area where like it's not right at certain sizes and things get cut off, or things that aren't usable or are broken for different sizes. You can also find cross-browser compatibility if you have problems, like which is another reason you have to talk to the client. Like, are they all a lot of these corporate clients are still like all using IE7 or IE8 internally. So you really want to make sure that things work on those browsers. And if you don't paint yourself, you might have like an intern do that. Design issues can just be like distracting things that like just keep you from being able to find what you're doing. And then readability, I think, is one of the most important things on the front end. Like, how big are the fonts? How good is the spacing, the colors? Like, is it easy to read content on this site? And you'll kind of get a sense for that when you try reading it yourself, and you keep on trying to force yourself to read it, and you just can't get yourself to read any text on this site because it's just the readability of the design is not there, and that's such an easy thing to fix. Okay, so now I'm going to go back into the different concerns and look at things that way. So security. So security is like whether they ask you to do a security audit or not, or if they don't care about security. Security is just always important. So you kind of have to do that because it's just taking your vitamins. So security review module is very helpful. You'll find a lot of issues. PHP module, sadly, is a module that has been in core. I guess it's finally out for Drupal 8, but it's been very, very common when you do a site audit that they're using PHP module. The problem with PHP module is it's a security problem because as soon as somebody gets access to an account on your site that can use it, they can take control of your database and potentially your server. And it's also a big maintainability problem. So it's very difficult to maintain a site if there's a lot of custom PHP in the database, especially if you're trying to upgrade it to a new version of Drupal that has a totally different API. None of that stuff is going to work, and it's going to be really hard to find it because they might have like 100 copies of the same PHP snippet just changed slightly. Now somebody's going to manually have to go and deal with those 100 things differently. So it's like a huge problem that for the long term. Permissions are very commonly an issue when you're going through a security audit, and the security review module does help flag any permissions problems. They also like to look through them manually. I'm going to talk about permissions again in a minute. And then SSL configuration. It's sort of, in the past 5 years, I think everyone in the web community has sort of embraced SSL everywhere, but there's still a lot of sites out there that are not using SSL. And so if you're allowing your staff to log into your site, but you're not using SSL or forcing SSL, then they can have their password taken really easily if they're in a public Wi-Fi. And then you've lost control of your site completely. Another thing related to that is a really easy way to get hacked is for your staff to have weak passwords or to write down their passwords or share their passwords and things like that. So that's actually some of the most important things you can do to improve security is to add a module that's a password policy module, and also to educate all of the staff that have higher permissions on the site. They need some education about web security and how to handle their passwords. Input formats in Drupal are a common security problem, and security review module checks for this as well. So it's really common that you might have an input format called filtered HTML, but they've turned off the filtering of HTML on that input format, so now it's called something that sounds secure, but it's no longer secure. So since those things are configurable and people don't always realize how much of a security hole input formats can be, that's often misconfigured in Drupal. This is just a wallpaper pattern that I made, showing you when you go through the permissions page, you have to kind of read this wall of checkboxes, and it can be hard to not make mistakes as you're going through that huge page. The key to really making sure the permissions are set properly is just to drag the roles into a good order. So you can rearrange the roles on the roles page, and then you want to have anonymous on one side and a super admin all the way on the other side. And then you can just scroll through this huge wall of checkboxes and just pay attention to things where the anonymous side seems to have things checked, or just kind of look at the untrusted roles like that. And you can find anything that sticks out. Because I think a lot of people get dizzy when they're looking at that page, and then they check God knows what. Performance audit, you have to kind of define how far you're going to go into your performance audit, because it's possible to spend weeks just evaluating performance of a site. So you kind of have to draw a line somewhere. But some of the common things that I'll see doing a performance audit, a lot of sites don't use a CDN. Using a CDN is a super quick thing to do and a really big win for performance for a lot of sites. Lots of sites have way too much external JavaScript that makes them slow. Like John was saying yesterday, a good resource is webpagetest.org to see what's going on. A lot of sites, it's the front end that's actually the slowest part. So all the time that you spend adding layers of caching in Drupal won't make any difference if it's really the front end that's slow. And then if you want to get deeper into it, if it's on the PHP MySQL side, XHProc is a really good tool for digging in and finding out what's actually really slow. I think it's kind of crazy how people, if their site is mostly only anonymous users and they're getting the site in Varnish, how it's okay, well, we're going to cache the blocks, and then we're going to cache the views, and then we're going to cache the panels, and then we're going to cache the page, and then we're going to send it all to Varnish. It's it could be really overkill to like cache and cache and cache and cache multiple layers. So you really have to evaluate the specific site and where your gains really would be. Okay, maintainability, like I was saying, I'm very focused on maintainability because I think the lack of emphasis of maintainability is what really makes organizations pay a lot of unnecessary expense. Like I think most of their expenses go to problems with maintainability. And I like this picture because you can kind of imagine like the opposite end of this picture. I mean, I actually think I'm kind of living that in my basement, where it's like you can't even find, it takes you 10 minutes just to find a screwdriver. And I think that's what my basement's like, but that's what a lot of sites are like. When you're doing these projects, you're like, okay, well, first I have to spend half an hour trying to figure out where that code is even coming from, because they have like 5 different systems that seem like they might be doing it. And then everything in the code that I found is super confusing, so that took me like an extra 2 hours to like dig through there, and then it broke this other thing because that was all brittle, right? So like everything that should take 5 minutes on the average 2-year-old Drupal site now somehow is taking 8 hours, and it's because things are disorganized and confusing. So anything that's disorganized and confusing, a lot of times people are like, well, that's not a big issue. But I'm like, you have no idea. Like, most of our problems are because things are disorganized and confusing. So some of the things that I look at focused on maintainability are unused modules. And there's a module, unused modules, that helps you find unused modules. Those can also be a performance issue if they're missing in a certain way. The use of PHP module, like I was saying. Another thing that's a similar approach as PHP module that I see a lot is code per node module. Code per node module is this awful module that lets people add custom CSS and JavaScript to any node on their site. And some editors who have a background, like maybe running their site in Dreamweaver or something, they love this module. It's like, I don't know Git, I don't have like a local machine, I just want to do some CSS and JavaScript, so I love this. And now you're like, oh, okay, so we have like cross-browser issues and responsive issues that are different on every single page of the site because you put custom CSS and JavaScript in all of them. The only way for us to resolve this and fix this is to go through all 500 nodes where you wrote like all this code and like manually figure out what you were trying to do and make patterns out of it and like reverse engineer this whole thing. It's a huge nightmare. Another thing is that most sites won't have any automated tests. The last site that I audited, I found they actually got me access to their previous vendor's ticketing system, which was great. And I found like there was like a ticket in there that was like, write automated tests for everything. It had like 0 hours tracked to it. It's like, okay, I guess they tried, but I don't see how they thought that would work. Okay, so really related to maintainability is this concept of simplicity. Because I think a lot of the things that cause maintainability problems are caused by confusion. Did anybody read this book? It's kind of new for this Japanese lady about the like art of tidying up. It's like the magical art of tidying. Nobody read that? Yeah. Okay. That's a really great book, and I think it's the same sort of concept sort of applies to your home as to a website, where it's like the simpler you keep things, the faster you can find them, and less confusion. And it's obviously a lot easier to maintain things if you have like less of them and you have only the ones that you need. And I really see these websites as they are very complex. Like there's a reason that we go to these events and our brains explode hearing about all these complex things. This is complex stuff. And so it's complex like surgery. And so you can't just be all willy-nilly and like, oh, I forgot some things inside the patient's body, I'll maybe get them out later. Like, I mean, you have to take this seriously. Like, I'm not like a neat freak at home, but when it comes to these websites, they really need to be clean and simple to be maintainable. So I'll find all different types of things that are sort of a smell against the concept of simplicity, and all of them are actual issues that make it harder to maintain the site. So one of the things is like just too many of anything, too many everything. So most of these sites have too many modules, too many content types, too many fields, views, vocabularies, roles, lines of code, menu items, menus, templates, input formats. Like everything in Drupal is so easy to add a new one. And it's so hard to delete anything because you're not sure if it's being used somewhere else or not. You can't remember. You didn't document anything. So now things tend to accumulate and they don't tend to go away. And you'll even see things like a content type that's like test type delete me. And they're still afraid to delete it, right? Because they're so afraid to delete anything that, it's just this clutter. And you also will find like multiple systems for doing the same thing. And this is like a real serious issue. So a project I was working on recently, they had 2 different sharing systems, like for like Facebook and Twitter. They had 2 different systems. So I spent like 3 hours trying to figure out how to like add a Facebook share button to a page. It turned out I was looking at a system that they weren't even using because they had 2 of them enabled. And so like every time you do something like that, and then if I didn't clean that up, then the next person who came along, who they asked to do something, would lose 3 hours again. So like when you have a mess like that and you don't clean it up, people could lose 3 hours every single time they touch it. Right? So it's kind of like, it might seem picky that I pick on those things, but it's like I see so much time getting lost to these things. Usability and IA audit, like I always look at the WYSIWYG, content creation. A lot of times the WYSIWYG has buttons that don't even do anything because it gets filtered out, the input format. There's a lot of times problems with path patterns and breadcrumbs not being good and consistent. That's a very common like Drupal issue. A lot of times there's no content workflow. The navigation's hard to use. And then a lot of times as I'm going through, I'll see things about the process that are alarming. Like there often is no documentation. So you ask like, where's the documentation? There's none. A lot of times there's no issue tracking system. That there is bad communication with the people who are on the client side. Like they might be fighting each other. You may find that out just doing the audit. So those things are super important to address. Okay, so I just want to talk really quickly about actually formatting and sending them the audit. So I'll usually do like a table of contents. You definitely want to do like an executive summary type thing at the beginning because there's definitely going to be people there. Your audit's going to be like 50 pages long potentially, like at least 20. So there's definitely going to be people who aren't going to read that. And you want the executive summary to be pretty not super technical. Then you want to go through each thing that you were looking at, give recommendations. I like to put a lot of screenshots. It helps them understand what I'm referring to because a lot of times they don't have the same vocabulary. And then you can use colors and icons to make things stand out and be like, okay, this actual part looked good, or this is urgent, serious problem, or whatever. And that makes it a lot easier for people to scan through and see what's going on. You really need to like read through it, have somebody else read through it before you send it. Make sure that you never veer towards being critical of people instead of critical of the end result. I guess that's maybe a personal problem of mine, but a lot of times, but not always, some of the people involved who are going to read the audit are the ones that made the site, so you don't want to piss them off too much. So these are just some like a piece of a table of contents from a recent audit, so you can see I kind of go through like security. I just work in Google Docs because I like to work together with people quickly. This is like a section where I'm telling someone quickly like what input formats are. I'm trying to show them in a screenshot and explain why they have a problem. Here I'm telling them why they need a bug tracking system. Okay, and then make sure that there's some plan for follow-up after you deliver this audit, because what happens a lot of times is they just don't read it or do anything. So you need to kind of help them, like walk them through the findings and facilitate discussions. And don't let them just ask you to estimate fixing every single thing in the audit, because it's always about prioritization together, collaboratively, and you never want to fix everything unless you have like an unlimited budget. You always want to like find out what their priorities are and, you know, reprioritize things and work towards priorities together. And it's really important to like collaborate and get their feedback on it, which can be challenging after the audit, especially if you've overwhelmed them with the audit. So try to have empathy with your audit. Thank you. We don't have that much time, but any questions? Yeah?
So I guess I have two questions. I lost one. So are you going to put an example, like an audit that you do, that you guys like a sample or anything? Is that possible? Like, I'd be interested to hear that, because it sounds like you know what you're doing.
Sure. Yeah, I can add. I don't know if you can see what my URL is. I can add a whole example, but I have to like anonymize it first.
Yeah. No, like if you can't do it because of that, like you don't want to do the extra work with that stuff, that's really cool. I was just curious.
Yeah, I can. I just have to blur some stuff. Hang on, I'm trying to make this bigger so you can see that if you want a copy of the slides, and I can add that info to the end. So yeah, here you go. There's the slides. That's an easy URL. You should have no problem memorizing that.